The Russian ambassador to Turkey was shot and killed in Ankara on December 19th. Will the assassination bring Russia and Turkey closer together? And how will it affect events in Syria? In recent years, relations between Russia and the U.S. have substantially degraded. With the end of the Obama administration, will there be improvements in the U.S.-Russia relationship? In 2016, Donald Trump was elected as the U.S. president. Britain voted to leave the European Union. Is 2016 a lucky year for Russian President Vladimir Putin? OPEC has agreed to cut oil production, boosting the price of the oil on which Russia's trading power depends. Does this signal a revival for the Russian economy?
Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. At the end of an eventful year for Russia, President Vladimir Putin has given his annual press conference. In addition to the assassination of the Russian ambassador to Turkey, the war in Syria, the Russian economy, and the alleged hacking of the U.S. presidential elections are just a few of the topics that came up. To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Teng Jianjun, a senior research fellow at the China Institute of International Studies, and Anna Tangen, author and columnist. We shall also cross over to speak with Professor Vladimir Kozin, head of a group of advisors to the director of the Russian Institute for Strategic Studies, via telephone. Welcome to Dialogue, gentlemen. What do you think are the most impressive messages that President Putin delivered at the press conference that has just been concluded at this moment?
There are several points we can mention here, but I think the most important part is the cooperation with Turkey. You mentioned just now the relations between Russia and Turkey at this moment. I think so far so good, especially after the military coup in Ankara this summer. And some said the information from Russia saved the life of the Turkish President Erdogan. So after that, the relation between the two countries has been warmed up. This is a very good, relation at this moment, I think.
You only talked about the foreign relationship topic. What about the economy? Russian economy took President Putin almost 1 hour to dwell upon, because that will lay the groundwork for his presidency and popularity.
I think this is actually another topic Putin mentioned repeatedly during his briefing today, and he gave such an ambitious plan. But I think the atmosphere at home and abroad not so good so far, because of the international economy has been slowed down in recent years, and the oil prices decreased sharply. And at home, I think this is actually another reform Putin would like to carry out. But I think the market and also the bureaucratic government also gave some negative impact on his decision, and this is a really hard job for Putin to
So,
go
Anna,
ahead.
do you think the Russian reliance on raw material and energy will be the Achilles heel for the Russian economy, and therefore that will be the devastating vulnerability for any resumption of its vitality?
No, I mean, people have to be realistic. These are cyclical times, and right now, with both China on course and the U.S. going up marginally, this is very, actually, I see it as a little differently. I think it's very good news domestically for Putin. In 2015, they had a 3.7 decrease in their GDP, negative numbers. This year, they're forecasting 1%. They revised that to 0.7%. So this is going, and next year could be a small surplus. So domestically, this is very, very good news for him, because it gives him the ability to say, look, we stood up to the greatest powers in the world sanctioning us, and yet we're still able to expand. And so this, I think, will be playing. You also notice that he mentioned $40 oil, and I think quite frankly, I think it's going to be higher than that, and I think he's underestimating it, so that if there is, in fact, a continued surge in oil prices, there will be a little extra money on the table. The bad news, though, is that he's spending quite a bit, 4.7% of GDP, up from about 2.7% of GDP, on military expenditures. Obviously, there's taking a heavy toll in terms of the fighting in Syria.
good news is also the latest rating by the Bank of America's Merrill Lynch that listed Russia ahead of China among the emerging markets, which says the liquidity and the budget, as well as the financial strength of Russia, is more vibrant or are more vibrant than those of China. So what do you think of the resilience of the Russian economy? Are you optimistic or pessimistic despite the alleged connection between the Euro-Asian Economic Union and the Belt and Road Initiative, a brainchild of President Xi Jinping throughout much of Central Asia, which used to be the backyard of the former Soviet Union?
Yeah, there are a lot of potentials in the economic development in Russia, but I think there are at least two areas we can discuss here. The first is the international environment is good for Russia for the future development, especially so many sanctions already imposed on Russia, especially after the crisis in Ukraine. And this is actually will be continued. In recent days, President Obama and the U.S. Congress also, imposed another round of sanctions against Russia. There must be a possibility for the U.S. and Russia warm up at this moment after the new president comes into the office of White House. And this is an international factor we should take into consideration. Another is a domestic development, because you mentioned just now the raw material, played a very important role in the economic development. And according to the studies in Russia, the oil price should maintain at the $60 a barrel. That is the bottom line for the economic recovery of Russia. But now it's very hard to give such a price.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me cross over to Mr. Vladimir Kozin, our Russian guest speaker, who's standing by on the phone in Moscow. Hello.
Hello, sir.
Vladimir, can you brief us on the alleged distortion in your economic structure, which might be the curse for the economic prospects of Russia? And second, I wonder if you can tell us why President Putin is able to enjoy 82% of the approval rating despite the adversity of the economic situation.
So, in practical terms, instead of having economy decline last year in 2015, that was minus 3.7%. I reiterate, 3.7%. This year is expected as minus 0.5 or 0.6%. So the inflation rate for 2016 is expected at the level of 5.5%, 5.5, not so bad. But one of the speakers has mentioned our defense expenditures on national defense, while it was nearly 3% this year, the next year is expected by 4.7%. And in 2018, the year after, it is expected as 3.7%. So it's quite an uplift for us because of involvement in resolving Syrian anti-terrorist campaign, and because of NATO build-up near Russian borders.
Well, Vladimir, excuse me for breaking in, but what you call not very bad economic situation for Russia could be viewed by most of the Chinese friends here as a disaster for your president and the economic performance. So tell us why he is still so popular, why he still enjoys 82% of the popular voting. I mean, approval rate.
Well, simply because we have managed to overcome any sort of sanctions imposed against us by the European Union and by the United States separately.
Why?
Because,
I'm asking why, Vladimir, why you were able to overcome the economic sanctions.
Yeah, because we have intensified various branches and refused to rely upon exporting goods from the Western countries. And that's why, for example, in our agriculture there is a boost in production of lorries, in chemical industry, in light industries, in production of arms and military hardware. There is a solid upsurge. So that's why we have a positive external trade balance, positive in aggregate figures, $70 billion. 70 means 70. Plus, Russians are extremely honored and are rejoicing that President Vladimir Putin has managed to implement a long-cherished dream of Russians to reunite Crimea with historic, cultural, and spiritual motherland.
Thank you very much.
Russia.
I will get back to you, Vladimir, for more of your comments, but back to the Beijing studio here. Now, Vladimir Kozin put his finger on a very important issue, that is the return of Crimea from Ukraine, and he is therefore, Putin is therefore viewed as a national hero in uniting and shoring up the morale of the Russians who were facing economic decline, and economic sanctions were imposed on Russia after the annexation of Crimea.
Actually, this is a political gambling by the president of Russia, Putin. He gave such an effort to take Crimea, return to Russia, and this is really a big step for the Russian to give some response to the crisis in Ukraine. And after the takeover of Crimea, the Western countries, especially the United States, gave several rounds of sanctions against Russia.
I'm a little bit surprised at your use of the wording gambling, because if that were to be true and could be viewed as a legitimate national concern of the Russians, then it's not the first of its kind. If you look at the Abkhazia and South Ossetia that were encouraged to be independent despite the rule intervention from Georgia, and former President Saakashvili was given a serious lesson by the Russian troops. And the Europeans, surprisingly, blamed the reckless behavior of former President Saakashvili of Georgia. What do you think of the popularity of Mr. Putin?
Well, obviously it's linked to nationalistic concerns. I mean, the Russians are tough people. They react very, very strongly when they are threatened. I mean, Napoleon found out this to his surprise, and so did Hitler. They're not people who are going to be easily pushed around. And he appeals to that. He's a strong man, both physically and everything that he does. He appeals to this Russian sense that I'm not going to be toyed with anymore.
He's a populist and charismatic strongman in
Russian
right. politics.
But let's look at the basics. Go back to his speech in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference. He laid out in 34 minutes a very, very detailed picture of how he saw the world and Russia's place in it. And he made it very clear that he thought that Russia had been humiliated by the West, and that he was not going to stand for a unipolar world in which Russia was marginalized. And he's gone forward. Interestingly, what has changed, though, at that time he was trumpeting the UN as the arbiter of all things against unilateral actions. But after that, you see these adventures in these different places, including the unilateral taking of Ukraine and the Sevastopol.
Okay, thank you very much. Of course, President Putin vows to return Russia to the rightful place in the center stage of world politics after his mentor Boris Yeltsin died, and after Mr. Boris Yeltsin gave him the mandate and the heritage and the legacy of his years to Putin, who surprisingly gave the world a big surprise. We'll be back after the short break. Stay with us, please. Welcome back. Let me go back to Vladimir Kozin for his comments on the Russian national security concerns. Hello, Vladimir. Now, our guest speaker, Anna Tangen, went back to the 2007 Munich Security Conference and referred to Mr. Putin's keynote presentation about how and why Russians had felt the humiliation that was imposed on Russia in the early 1990s with eastward expansion of the NATO. Now, do you think this sense of being humiliated by the NATO and the United States is still deeply rooted in the heart and mind of the Russians? Hence, President Putin enjoys enormous popularity at this moment, despite the quite adverse economic situation.
Mm-hmm. Well, we are not only are being humiliated by certain Western leaders or leaders in the Asia Pacific, but we have been also neglected as a key player on the international relations, on the international arena. We have been also unjustifiably being labeled as aggressor or annexer, and the entire Russian population is against such labels, like I have said to you. So we, in order to restore our ties with NATO countries and with the United States and with many other nations who are still hostile to us, we have to ask them to eradicate this kind of nasty wording in terms of Russia and in terms of Russian leaders, in terms of rank-and-file Russian people. And
now, excuse me, Vladimir.
Military build-up around us.
Vladimir, excuse me, there's obviously warm chemistry between President-elect Donald Trump and President Putin. You could look at their exchange of greetings, as well as why President Obama decides to launch an investigation into the alleged Russian interference with the presidential election in the United States. But also, I wonder if you agree with me, Vladimir, there's a growing momentum among European leaders to lift economic sanctions, particularly if you look at what's going to happen next year. The year 2017 promises to be an election year for France and Germany, and many of the presidential hopefuls, particularly in France, made no secret that they're going to lift economic sanctions. So what do you think of that impact for your friends across the, for the Americans across the Atlantic Ocean? Vladimir, very quickly.
Well, as it is known, the European Union has extended economic and individual sanctions against the Russian Federation and too many Russian companies and individuals. But I think that when Donald Trump enters the White House and becomes the 45th U.S. president, he, as a real businessman, will probably lift off all these sanctions, and Europeans will follow suit after the United States, because they are irrelevant, they are unfair, because we have done nothing wrong to face these sanctions. Because if we are wrong,
listen,
Germany,
I hate to say this. If there's aggression by the U.S., I think we can label it as aggression. If it's aggression by Russia, we can label that. You're saying that you don't use nasty words towards Russia, but you're using nasty words towards the West. You're saying these countries are irrelevant is, not going to solve the issue. So let us be fair. I think Russia has its concerns, obviously, but this is a time of real politics. And quite frankly, Putin is a master of it. And he's been playing both the European Union and the United States like a master. So let's not pretend here about nuances of who's saying what.
Jianjun, do you think Mr. Putin stands a good chance of having remarkable improvement, if not a thaw, in the relationship between Moscow and Washington? Now, Vladimir said 1 minute ago on the phone that most Russians seem to have a very optimistic sentiment towards Donald Trump, who is fundamentally a businessman, and therefore, do you think Russians would be proved wrong, like most of the Chinese who had predicted that this shrewd business executive would deal with China the way he does business. But we were all proved wrong. If you look at the Mad Dog, James Mattis, John Bolton, now the whole team of the transition team is full of, teamed with hawks, those who are hostile to China and perhaps to Russia. What do you think of the note of optimism that our Russian friend Vladimir Kozin shares with us?
First, I should say the retired generals might be very cautious, when they are thinking about the war, because they all have experienced the bloody, wars, and this is the argument. I think in terms of the relations between Russia and the United States, that there is a possibility for the two countries to be warmed up just because of Donald Trump's policy for Russia. First, I think in the Middle East, the main target, as disclosed by the MOU, days ago in the Department of Defense, saying that the fight against IS is #1 job for Donald Trump. And that might be a common battlefield for Russia and the United States to fight against the terrorists in that region. They can have some cooperation. And in terms of economic cooperation, I think they would be Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. Actually, he had a lot of investment in Russia. Even today, after the sanction, all the investment were frozen by the sanction. And I'm sure Donald Trump is very different from the previous president, different from President Obama and other presidents in the United States. He takes the United States as a company. I think his purpose is to make a lot of benefit or profit for the state.
Right.
And this might be a change for the relation between the two countries.
A country is not a business.
Yeah, but
this is
Donald
Trump
just
he thinks it is, and he thinks he's the ultimate deal maker. But the issue is he being played? His whole strategy seems to be get closer to Russia in an attempt to create tensions with China. And this is, I guess, his idea of his own kind of pivot towards Asia. That he's playing with fire. This is not well thought out. Putin has no reason whatsoever, if you go back to that 2007 speech and everything we just heard, to love the West. There's no reason for him to try to help the United States gain the very, become a unipolar polar power again. So there's real questions about where Donald Trump thinks he's going with this and whether Putin will go
back
along.
in the year 2007, President Putin found himself talking to an audience that might be very sympathetic with the idea of multilateralism, because the European Union has, for many years, stood for and called for multilateralism as opposed to preemptive strikes and unilateralism of a legacy of the Bush Jr. administration. Having said this, let me remind you of yet another tweet of President-elect Donald Trump. He said the United States would strengthen its nuclear capability. Similarly, his Russian president, not his Russian counterpart yet, but President Putin also said something like the Russian nuclear capability and ambition. What do you think of the message that both wanted to convey to each other or to the rest of the world?
It is inconceivable that you would put out by Twitter on a subject that could destroy the world, and that in response to this, the president of Russia says, oh, it's no big deal. He said he was going to do that in his campaign. This is doing it. We're doing it. This is almost unbelievable.
I understand very well your feeling, personal feeling, but Jian Qun, at the very beginning of his presidency, Mr. Obama won Nobel Peace Prize largely for his appeal for having a nuclear-free world. However, twice politicians in Moscow and Washington tried in vain to reduce the number of nuclear warheads. And the latest case being former President Medvedev vowed to reduce the nuclear arsenal on both sides to just 1,500 nuclear warheads for both. And yet, currently, each side has over 7,000 nuclear warheads. But we are talking about nuclear warheads in service. Actually, there could be quite a few hundred more nuclear warheads that can be used and installed very quickly if parties in the game decide to go to war. So what do you think of the futile attempt by both sides to have nuclear disarmament?
Actually, the two superpowers in nuclear arsenal actually gave another round of arms races, especially in recent years after the bad relations between the two countries. And Putin adopted a very tough policy in this area, and actually there was a fundamental change in recent years. During the Cold War time, Russia just used their conventional force, and the NATO heavily relied on nuclear arms. And nowadays, I think Russia began to rely on the nuclear weapon and the recent nuclear submarine, nuclear warheads, and mobile delivery system, and also some new missiles also deployed in Russia. This is actually the pillar for Russian security.
Well, of course, during the Cold War, nuclear deterrence did help the two superpowers avert, narrowly perhaps, having a third world war. However, do you think in the post-Cold War era, Anna, nuclear deterrence should be employed as an effective means of deterrence that prevent major powers from going to war? Why does President Putin emphasize the use of a nuclear arsenal over and over, as if he's gonna rely on nuclear capability to help put Russia on the center stage of world politics? Will that work?
I don't believe so, and I think the problem that both superpowers are overlooking is this idea that the rest of the world is arming itself. I mean, it's not talked about, but Israel, it's believed they have between 150 and 200 nuclear devices, most of them pointing at Iran. You have Iran, North Korea, other nations looking at this. I mean, there was that when Trump said, I think Japan and South Korea should just get their own umbrella and take care of it. This is irresponsible talk. The idea of mutually assured destruction between two great powers is one thing, but when you have entities which are based on religion, whether it's between India and Pakistan or North and South Korea or other places, this is a tinderbox.
The other day when we were discussing the impact of the political assassination of Ambassador Karlov in Ankara, we did address the issue of Syria. With the takeover of Aleppo, a major city in Syria. Does that indicate an apparent turning point in the civil strife of Syria? And what does that mean for Putin in further consolidating his position as a major power in world politics? Very quickly.
Yeah, I think this is a very big event for Russia and for Putin after the take of the city. And this gave Putin another, driving force to go ahead. And since his intervention last a year, this is very important for him.
With the establishment of Russia, Iran, Turkey axis in the Middle East, perhaps President-elect Donald Trump will seize this as an opportunity to beat retreat from the Middle East, a volatile region, and perhaps a hot potato for the new U.S. administration. We'll keep talking about this when we come back next time. Until then, goodbye.